Former Secretary of the Interior Sally Jewell's resume is long and winding. She began her career as a petroleum engineer, moving on to become an executive in the banking industry and later the CEO of REI, the popular outdoor goods store. After being appointed to her position at Interior, she focused on taking a long view, science-based approach to resource management, and made rebuilding relationships with indigenous communities a central part of the department's mission. She is currently a fellow at the Harvard University Institute of Politics. All right, thanks so much for joining us, Secretary. Much of your career has been focused on connecting people with the outdoors. And as people move into cities and become urbanized more and more, how can governments and business make sure that people don't lose touch with the natural environment?
You know what, that's one of the critical issues, I'd say, of our time around the world. If we expect to have natural areas and national parks and public lands and city parks and so on, people have to feel a connection to nature. And for a variety of reasons, urbanization is one of them. You know, people are really busy and overscheduled, and technology and, social media and things that keep us away from the outdoors. We're not necessarily going to recognize what's at stake. And so I think what we need to do at every level of public land management is make sure that we are making the outdoors part of people's everyday lives. So what might that look like in an urban area? It might look like safe routes to school to ride your bike. It might look like a park or an open space with an easy walk. It might look like outdoor activities as part of daycare center activities or after school programs if it can't be incorporated into the school. And I'd also say bringing back recess and getting kids to get outside and be comfortable in that environment is actually critical, not just for those children and their health, but also for recognizing that nature is fundamental to our souls. And so I think that we have a bit of a challenge in an urban area, but I think that also gives us a great opportunity to say, let's make sure that green spaces and open spaces are part of people's everyday lives and that there's a bridge between that and broader natural areas. So I want to give you a quick example from the work of Interior. When I was there, we launched a youth initiative, and it had sort of a continuum of engagement of young people in nature and the outdoors, and it started with play. Let's just let kids play outside without telling them what to do. So we worked with the YMCA, which is actually the largest daycare provider in the United States, serving about 6 million children every single day, and said, will you convene all the youth-serving organizations along with the federal public land managers like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, together with state parks and city parks and county parks, and strategize on how we bring the outdoors into these kids' everyday lives. So that's play. Then there's learn. We did the Every Kid in a Park Pass, which gave every fourth grader in America a free pass to all of America's public lands for themselves and their families. Wow. It's like the America the Beautiful Pass. It's normally $80 a year. And that went from then play to learn, and we organized our programming around that fourth grade cohort to serve. And that's a little older group. It's like come out and do service projects on public lands. It might be removing invasive species, building trail, cleaning up garbage. But when you do that, it gives you a connection to that place that never leaves you. And then work. It's opening people's eyes, young people, to jobs and opportunities in public land management that wouldn't even have been on their radar. So a lot of work done during the time that I was at Interior in terms of really saying what is the issue, who are the logical partners, and how do we create that continuum that reconnects an increasingly disconnected population to nature and the outdoors.
Yeah, well, and on that note of partnerships, your time as CEO of REI was spent really expanding their advocacy efforts in that area and in environmental advocacy. How do you think that played a role in policymaking, and should other businesses be pursuing that same approach?
Well, I think that as I look back over the course of my career, REI was an important chapter. I had 19 years in banking. I started my career in oil and gas as an engineer. And I think the breadth of experience, as a banker, I banked farmers and ranchers and mining companies and logging companies and fishing companies. At REI, I was working with the outdoors more as a place where people renewed the soul and the spirit. They went on vacation, they went to recreate. And that really is sort of encapsulates the importance of our public lands from a variety of different interests. And I'd say those all came together as Secretary of the Interior. I think that the value of public lands to feed our souls, the value of public lands to talk about our journey from the ancient Pueblo people that we see in the cliff dwellings and the ruins throughout the desert Southwest, to our journey as settlers coming to this country through civil rights and other human rights, is an important part that needs to be told. And I think my work at REI helped me understand the value of the national parks and recreation in the outdoors, but being an Interior, also those other stories that are essential to connect people to the outdoors and connect people to our public lands and our history and our culture that they may not even have known was there. The other thing I learned at REI is how big and important the outdoor recreation economy is. I think particularly now in 2017, there's a lot of rhetoric about extractive industry jobs and how valuable those are. What about the jobs in tourism and outdoor recreation and designing product for the outdoors? It's an 8.6 million job industry, or excuse me, 7.6 million job industry with over $800 billion of economic impact. It generates far more in federal and state tax revenue than the oil and gas industry generates in royalties to the federal government and states, and yet that's not understood. And I think being at REI helped us quantify the value of outdoor recreation and therefore help people understand that public lands, protected public lands, have tremendous value. They are not just there for the ability of us to extract resources and therefore impact them for future generations.
Absolutely, and while it is certainly true that you did a lot of advocacy at REI, I think we could both agree that a lot more work needs to be done in increasing awareness of those issues. Do you think other businesses should be stepping up? And if so, how can they make that happen?
There is no question that there's an adage that I learned when I was at REI and I was beginning to engage with members of Congress on the importance of public lands, not only to REI's business, but to the economy of their local communities. I learned a phrase, and I've used it over and over again: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Those industries that want to extract resources from public lands, and they are a part of our economy, and I acknowledge that, are very wealthy industries that are very effective at getting their point across, making contributions to candidates, and making sure that their interests are protected. If you look at outdoor recreation and tourism and many jobs associated with public lands, I like to say it's 100 miles wide and a quarter of an inch deep, and there's very little political engagement. So in July of 2017, I met with outdoor industry leadership, about 1,200 of them, at the Outdoor Retailer Trade Show, and said, our public lands are under threat right now with the Trump administration, and don't take for granted somebody's going to carry that water for you. It is your job on behalf of your industry and the people that you employ and the people that you serve as your customers and your shareholders, that you be engaged politically, that you help politicians understand how important these public lands are to your businesses, are to the economies of their states or their congressional districts, and how you're going to hold them accountable for making smart decisions that actually benefit the people that are their constituents. And I think that that message is really important, and it's not something that's just going to be carried, for example, by environmental groups on behalf of public lands.
Considering that public lands are mostly in the West, the Midwest somewhat, and those are very conservative areas, do you think that it's possible to move politicians to a better standpoint on public lands, or is it a battle that'll have to be fought in the private industry?
Public lands are beloved by everybody across the entire political spectrum, from the far right to the far left and all points in between. And they, the outdoor recreation users, whether they're off-road vehicle users, hunters, climbers, anglers, snow machines, backcountry skiers, you name it, they love their public lands. They love access to their public lands. And so I would say that it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. There are natural allies for public lands who need to speak up and make sure that everybody understands how important this is to them. I think at a time when you tend to have more of a right-leaning government, as we have right now in 2017, then maybe the sportsmen's group and the anglers groups have a voice that is more effective, and maybe when the left-leaning government is in power, you have a louder voice from, say, the environmental organizations. Companies should be really not partisan, but looking out for the interests of public lands broadly, their customers, their employees, and so on. So I think that there are great advocates for the value of public lands no matter what, and that's certainly something that I worked hard as Interior Secretary to make sure that I listened to a variety of groups, including extractive industries, and how do you have that right balance so that they can continue to maintain what's important for their part of our economy without damaging the parts of the economy that are dependent on public lands, and the value of public lands for those that have no vote and have no voice, like the animals, the fish, the future generations who are not yet born, who are going to inherit what we leave them. And I want to be proud of what I'm leaving to those future generations.
On that note, you've had a really unique career in that you've worked both in the oil industry and as an environmental regulator, regulating that same industry. Where do you think we lose nuance in the debate between those two groups, and where can those two groups find common ground?
You know, we all in this country have benefited from the ability to unlock hundreds of millions of years of energy generation stored in the form of oil and gas and coal to burn in the here and now to drive really the industrialization of the world and the strength of our economies and the quality of life of human beings. So we've all benefited from that. We've also now learned that there are impacts to those decisions that have a long-term bearing. I think as a petroleum engineer early in my career, and as an engineer in a bank that worked with all kinds of energy industries and extractive industries, I have an understanding of those trade-offs. I don't think anybody gets up in the morning and goes to work, no matter what industry they work for, saying, I want to damage the earth, I want to damage the environment, I want to leave a mess for my children and my children's children and generations forward. Nobody wants that. I think everybody would like to say, what's that right balance that enables me to raise my family, to enjoy nature, to be proud of what I am leaving to future generations. And I think part of the job of businesses and policymakers and elected officials is to work together to find those thoughtful compromises. So I'm going to give you an example, and it was a massive effort when we were at Interior to not have to list a small species called the greater sage grouse on the endangered species list, so that states would still be able to manage their permitting process for development, for recreation, for all of that. And in order to do that, because the bird has been under significant threat from disturbance, from a lack of sort of planning on the part of governments at every level, we undertook a major effort with the grazing industry, with the oil and gas industry, with 14 different Western states, with environmentalists, with public land managers, and said, what are the areas that are most critical to this species, and how do we protect them? What are the areas that are most critical for development? What are the areas that are most important for recreation or transmission lines? And how do we plan at a more of a landscape level so that the businesses have certainty that they aren't going to be shut down by a lawsuit from an environmental group because they're impacting habitat? The sportsmen and women know that the bird, which is a game species, is going to continue to thrive, that the 350 other species that rely on the sagebrush sea of the Great Basin and the Rocky Mountains will be there, so that the mule deer that they'd like to hunt or the wildlife photography remains intact, and yet we have a strong economy as well. And that was this massive effort with Republicans and Democrats, particularly at the governor's level and the state level, to do thoughtful planning on a way that everybody gave a little, but everybody got a little, and we ended up with the right kind of balance. And I think that's a model of how we can have these areas that are otherwise seemingly in conflict, listen to each other and come up with thoughtful solutions. Unfortunately, right now the Trump administration is looking to undo that, which is very frustrating to the Western governors that work so closely on it, both Republicans and Democrats. And I hope that calmer heads prevail and they recognize that this is an effort that is good for business, the extractive industries, it's good for public lands, and allow it to run its course.
Do you think that that model of bipartisanship and collaboration could be applied to other areas of government as well, especially in this polarized time?
Yeah, I mean, I think every area of our decision-making process would benefit from people sitting down with different ideological points of view to reach common ground, to listen to each other. You know, I think that there's a lot of reasons for this, but so much of our congressional districts around the country have been solidified as being one party or the other, that someone from the other party is never going to win there, that the real race for those positions is in the primary. And the primaries tend to bring out the extremes with low voter turnout. So a relatively small amount of our electorate are determining those who are representing us, and they tend to be more polarized than the population at large. And yet that centrist doesn't win oftentimes in a primary. And these are some things that I think we have to work on, because the American public wants people to work together. They want people to listen. And they're very frustrated, whether they're on the right or on the left. They're very frustrated with the lack of any kind of forward progress. And I think that that's, you know, a big problem for us right now that we would be well served to look at on a bipartisan basis, saying, you know, what kind of common ground can we reach so that we're proud of what we leave to future generations, as opposed to, you know, people that are just kind of in their little bubbles, listening to their friends and shooting at each other without actually coming together on common ground. And there are a few exceptions to that, but they're unfortunately the exception rather than the rule right now.
Well, and on the note of compromise, one of the most controversial positions you took during your time as secretary was on fracking, where you opposed state and local bans on fracking, saying we needed more research. And you took quite a bit of fire from both the right and the left for that decision. What do you think of the issue today? Do you think there's enough research now? And how did you navigate the complex environment of being attacked from both sides?
Well, I think that it's quick to find out in this job as Secretary of the Interior that there's no decision that you're going to make where somebody's not going to be mad at you. You know, coming from running REI, which is, I'd say, a pretty beloved business, to be in a situation where no matter what you do, you're getting vilified for it by somebody was a little bit different. I have fracked wells. I worked as a petroleum engineer. I understand the process, and I believe I also understand the risks. Now, fracking has moved dramatically in terms of the volumes, the pressure, the material, the horizontal drilling, the staged fracking, all of these things that have unlocked oil and gas from very tight formations that was not even considered recoverable at the time that I was in the business. So, but the fundamentals are there. They're very basic. And so they need to be regulated. Most companies are responsible actors, and they want to do the right thing. But up and down the chain, there are people that are not responsible actors, and when they don't act responsibly, they need to be held to account. Because the new fracking and the horizontal drilling has unlocked a lot of tight gas and oil reserves, it's happening in states that have had little or no oil and gas experience in the past and have no regulation. And the regulations that we promulgated were only in effect on federal lands and tribal lands. And those are the areas that are under jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior. In the case of federal lands, they're owned by all American people. And so even though those lands might be in the state of Wyoming or the state of Colorado, they're actually, the resources underneath them, the surface, are owned by all Americans. And so while we listen to the states and the local governments and we want to synchronize those regulations, we had a baseline minimum standard. Those were the fracking regulations that we promulgated. There are people on the environmental side that say all fracking is bad, it's evil. I don't think that's accurate. And I don't think that reflects an understanding of the physics and how drilling is being done now. And actually, when you can put 20 wells on a 2-acre pad and extract from a very broad area, that is far less environmentally damaging than if you put them on 5 acres or 10 acres and disturb the entire landscape, which is the way it used to be done. I also know, however, that there is a desire, and I share that desire, to move our economy away from a fossil fuel industry, to move toward renewables. We now understand the impact of carbon on our atmosphere. We understand the impact of methane. We also regulated the venting and flaring of methane. These are things that we didn't understand when I was in the industry. We do understand today, and I think it's our job as regulators to take the best available science and say, how do we apply that? So back to fracking, 3 main components. Do you have wellbore integrity? Is the frac fluid going where it needs to go and not where you don't want it to go? You don't want it to go up the back side of the pipe and into a formation you're not expecting. What are the chemicals being used, and what is their potential impact, and the disclosure of those chemicals? And then what happens when this massive amount of fluid, sometimes as much as 200 million gallons, comes back? What are you doing with it? If you put it in a pond and it's open, birds are going to fly there, critters are going to eat it, it could have an impact. What are you doing with it? And we said it's got to go back into tanks, it's got to be disposed of properly. And those are things that we were fought on, and actually our fracking regulation was stayed for a period of time. I think that lawsuit actually just got won, which is great news. Unfortunately, the succeeding administration is looking at redoing it, but they have to go through the same process that we went through in doing it, which requires a lot of science, a lot of public input, and I'm hopeful that those thoughtful regulations will stand the test of time.
It definitely, you have a unique perspective coming from the oil industry and with your experience as an engineer. So you definitely understand the science, and a lot of regulators do. How do you make that politically viable when most of American citizens and even most politicians don't understand all of that science? How do you package proposals and regulations in a way that they can understand and get on board with?
You know, I think that communication is key. People like things to be simple. Nothing really is simple. When John Kerry was running for president, he said, well, the answer is complex in a debate. And he was vilified for saying that's it's complex. The reality is the world is complex. The planet is complex. We are complex as individuals, and you really have to work hard to understand different perspectives, to understand the science, to understand the implications, to chart a thoughtful path that takes all of those things into account. And if you're speaking in sound bites, whether it's a politician trying to get reelected and doing a 30-second clip on a commercial, or trying to put their opponent down, or a nonprofit organization that's trying to raise a lot of money by hyping a particular issue, there is, I guess, an effective use of oversimplifying things that are complex. I learned from my career, and certainly as Secretary of the Interior, that if I was to do my job, which is representing all American people, and again, not just now, but thinking about I'm in the forever business, it's not just for this generation, but for future generations, how can I navigate that path using the best information that I can get? Recognizing that some of the decisions we make based on the science today may be changed in the future based on the science of tomorrow, and that's okay, but we've got to listen to the science of today, like the science of the impact of carbon, anthropogenic climate change, what we can do about that. And that is our job, even if it may not be politically popular. Fracking is an issue that was not necessarily politically popular for me to regulate and say it is a practice that should be allowable, but also standing up renewable energy on public lands and providing a bridge from where we are today as a fossil fuel dependent economy to future tomorrow, which is less dependent and ultimately not dependent on carbon generating sources of energy. And that's all part of the job, and it doesn't lend itself to a soundbite, obviously.
Yeah. During your time at Interior, you definitely took the department in a new direction, looking a lot at rebuilding relationships with indigenous communities, setting a long-term view for the agency, focusing a lot more on climate change. What do you view as your greatest accomplishments coming out of that tenure you had as secretary?
You know, it's a hard question to answer because there's no one given area. I'm enormously proud of the progress that we made in honoring our trust and treaty obligations to Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and providing a pathway to recognition for Native Hawaiians, the indigenous communities broadly of the United States. I think it's fair to say that there's been an acrimonious relationship over much of the time that the United States has been created, and having met with hundreds of different tribal leaders and visiting dozens, certainly many dozens of tribal communities, you feel the wrongs of the past. You feel the damage that has been done, the impact to self-esteem of these communities, and the ongoing impact of the decisions that prior administrations and government made that is very difficult to pull ourselves out of. And I think we made good progress, but it's only the beginning. Tribal education, which is the responsibility of the federal government, is the Bureau of Indian Education really struggled to meet the needs of students. And so we looked at why that was and made some very important steps. Many of those are continuing in the future to remedy that, whether it's the physical plant of the schools, the education of the teachers themselves, budgetary support for Indian education. So, I mean, that's one area that I'm very proud of. But there are others. Beginning to create a pathway to renewable energy, involving indigenous communities in that, addressing climate change head on, mitigation of climate change by standing up renewable energy, adaptation of our landscapes, increasing resilience, building back after Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy, recognizing the value of natural infrastructure, not just gray infrastructure, you know, bulkheads and, you know, hardening things, but wetlands and barrier islands and those natural protections that we have not really valued in the past, but we certainly understand the value of today. So I could go on, but I think recognizing the career staff, listening to the career staff, allowing their voice to be heard was something that was incredibly important, I think, in my role as Secretary of the Interior, and I think enabled them to do some very, very good work that all American people are going to benefit from.
Do you have any regrets from that time? Initiatives that you wanted to get through but just couldn't make happen?
Yeah, you know, nothing is finished, right? And I was in the middle of a lot of things when the transition occurred. And one of those things is that the federal coal program, the leasing, and it's largely in the Powder River Basin where, you know, you've got these coal seams that are 40 to 75 feet thick. We're being leased to coal companies without competition for those bids, without regard to the impact of the burning of that coal on the environment, sometimes less than $1 a ton, less than arm's length transactions, so royalties that should be paid to the state and the federal government to benefit all the people in that state and all the people in the country were being circumvented in some cases by the coal company mining the coal, selling it to a second company which they actually owned, that then sold it for 5 times, 10 times the price to a foreign buyer and paying royalties on that initial sale. So that might be $1 a ton, and maybe they're selling it for $10 a ton, and the taxpayer was losing out. So we did a programmatic environmental impact statement that I started. We got a lot of work done in scoping what needed to be done, and we didn't get it done, and the current administration, the Trump administration, dropped that process. So I regret that we didn't start it sooner. I regret we didn't get it done, but the work that we did do is very valuable, including listening to coal miners and coal companies and coal communities, as well as the broad population in a lot of open public meetings, and factoring that in, that I think will provide a roadmap for future administrations to take on, but we didn't get that done. And of course, Indian education, I wish I'd made more progress, but we did chart a good path forward. I mentioned the great work we did on with the American West and the Sagebrush Sea and the governors and so on the greater sage-grouse land protections and initiative with industry and so on. Some of that work's being undone, unfortunately, but it was a lot of good work that happened to begin with, and I think that the states are working to uphold that, even as the work may be undermined by the subsequent administrations. So the work is never done, but I think that we did a lot of good work that will stand the test of time.
One big thing that happened while you were secretary was Standing Rock in that demonstration. Did you feel constrained by the Obama administration at all as that was going on? And what are your thoughts on that movement?
You know, I think that the situation with the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Standing Rock tribe was an opportunity to educate the entire American public on the trust and treaty obligations that our federal government has to Native American tribes whose land we took in exchange for treaties that we are not fully upholding. And so I applaud the Standing Rock tribe, Dave Archambault, the chairman of the tribe, for standing up for their rights. I think that is generally misunderstood that the pipeline, and I'm not against pipelines, and neither is Dave or Chairman Archambault and the tribe, but the decision to run it in the most direct way, which would have gone north of Bismarck, North Dakota, which was changed to running it south very close to Standing Rock, half mile from the reservation underneath the reservoir that actually, by the way, flooded their lands and a number of their sacred sites and their fertile ground because of a dam that people didn't want downriver, so it flooded the tribal lands. To then run a pipeline under that lake was a bridge too far. Bismarck said, we don't want it here because it might pollute our water supply. If it leaks, it could impact the citizens of Bismarck, even though the citizens of Bismarck are generally benefiting from the oil economy. It's driven that economy in that community. It's not driven the economy in Standing Rock because it's too far removed from where that oil and gas is. So Standing Rock gets the pipeline and the risk without any of the economic benefits, and the Dakota Access Pipeline Company, Energy Transfer Partners, did not do appropriate consultation with the tribe, and that is on record, the tribe expressing its concerns going back to a number of years. So when the tribe objected and people came in solidarity and support, it had a huge impact on the tribe. I mean, financial impact, a lot of people came, but it put tribal rights on the map, and it engaged people in that dialogue that had no idea in the past. And I think that even though oil is flowing through that pipeline, it's been contested in court, Standing Rock has won the latest round, they've won a war, in a sense, of people recognizing tribal rights in the nation. And I think that they have energized indigenous communities to stand up for their rights, which is going to play out across the nation when other circumstances like this arise. So, you know, overall, I think it was a positive. I'm very proud of the Obama administration. I'm proud of Joellen Darcy, who headed the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and her team for saying, yes, we need to do an environmental assessment before we grant this easement across Lake Oahe. And so it is the Corps of Engineers that made the decision. And we were advising and supporting and encouraging because of our relationship with the tribes. So they made the right decision. That decision was reversed by the Trump administration, and I think that it was an enormous mistake, because the reasons that the Army Corps made the decision to do the environmental assessment is that they understood that they had not done appropriate work in the past, and they needed to do that. So, even though the pipeline has been completed, the easement has been granted, it's been challenged in court, and you know, we'll see where that goes. But the Obama administration, my colleagues across the administration, did not get in the way of our close work with the Army Corps of Engineers, ultimately to stand up for what we believed was the right thing, and that was for the company to do an environmental assessment.
Yeah, that feeds perfectly into what I want to talk about next, which is your successor, Ryan Zinke, who's definitely taking the agency in a very different direction than you did, shifting focus away from climate change and mitigating the impacts of that. The New York Times reports that almost 50 regulations have been or are about to be repealed. Are you worried about your legacy being erased? And beyond that, harm being done beyond what you fixed in your time?
There's nothing about the actions I took that was about my legacy. This is about doing the right thing for the American people and striking the right balance. I'm very disappointed in this administration's efforts. The only thing that seems consistent in this administration is to undo whatever the last administration did, even if it was done in a bipartisan way, working with states, working with industry, working with local communities. It doesn't seem to matter. My successor talks about being a Teddy Roosevelt Republican. I tweeted the other day with his review of national monuments that Teddy Roosevelt was rolling over in his grave. I think that much of the activities have been driven by undoing what was done before, as opposed to thinking about what do we need to do that benefits not just this generation, but generations forward. So yes, I'm very disappointed. The work to undo regulations, fortunately, other than those that were done from May of last year until the end of the administration, because those were, in some cases, overturned through the Congressional Review Act by Congress. But the other ones that they are looking at have to go through the same laborious process to undo that we went through to do them to begin with. So there's all kinds of public input. All of that stuff is a matter of public record. If they want to undo those regulations, they have to address exactly the same issues and the same concerns that we tried to strike the right balance of before they can undo them. And I'm glad that the process of regulation is difficult. It's hard to do them. It should be hard, but it's also hard to undo. So I take comfort in the fact that our folks did the right thing. They went by the book, and it's not going to be a matter of an ideological Secretary of the Interior able to undo things that a very thoughtful group of career staff worked with people within the communities and the constituency broadly to do to begin with.
In light of the changed focus, what do your former employees and career staff tell you about morale at the department, especially considering that a lot of people are leaving at the moment?
One of the biggest fears I have is that the incredible talent that I saw across the federal government is not feeling valued right now for all kinds of reasons. Budget is one of the reasons. Some of the comments and quotes that have been attributed to this administration and my successor in particular undermine people's sense of value, and none of us get up in the morning wanting to do a bad job. I have not met a federal public servant that's not looking to do their job for the benefit of the public and to go home every day feeling like they had an impact. And frankly, there's very few careers out there where you can have as much of an impact as working in federal government service or in government service at any level. So I try to not put career staff in an awkward position. I don't want to ask them about, how they feel. If they want to volunteer it, that's great. But, they are working for a new administration, and they have to be careful about what they say and what they do, and I respect that. I just want them to know that I value their work, and I want them to know how important it is, not just for me, but for future generations. And if I say anything, it is, I know we have ups and downs in budgets and so on. I hope you hang in there. The American people are relying on you hanging in there and continuing to bring your expertise to the table, even if you may not feel as valued as you should. And I hope that that is, in fact, what a lot of people do, because my worry is that incredibly talented people will leave, the positions will be eliminated, and then we're in a downward spiral of the of less ability of the government to do what people, they may not even appreciate that the government does for them, but without that they will, there'll be a gap, and it could be in earthquake early warning systems, it could be in stream gauges, it could be in, volcano sensing, as all of that from the USGS, it could be in visitor services, interpretation of, of our history, it could be in the protection of cultural sites in the National Park Service, it could be in addressing invasive species, protection of habitat, protection of species in the case of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it could be in not being able to address drought in the Bureau of Reclamation, it could be in acid mine drainage and challenges with the environment in the Office of Surface Mining. It could be in not being able to write grazing permits, not being able to write oil and gas permits, not being able to protect lands in the BLM, and of course, not being able to uphold our trust and treaty obligations to our nation's indigenous people and to the insular areas like the Virgin Islands, like Puerto Rico, like Guam and American Samoa, and the Northern Marianas Islands. All of those things rely on competent career staff. Our ability to do that is at risk right now with this administration.
All right, well, to close, you've made a lot of career transitions. What's next? What will be your next title?
Well, right now I'm a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard. I'm also a distinguished fellow at the College of the Environment at the University of Washington. What I'm getting out of this experience at the IOP at Harvard is a chance to interact with young people. And, I take that very seriously. I'm working hard on my study groups here, working hard to bring perspective and different perspectives to the table to help undergraduates at Harvard understand the importance of politics and the importance of engagement. So my next chapter will certainly involve an ongoing engagement with the new generations of scientists and policymakers and business people and leaders. Beyond that, I don't know.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you, Wyatt.
This has been an interview with Sally Jewell. For more articles, visit www.harvardpolitics.com.